Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about the ventricles of the brain. So the ventricles are essentially just spaces that we have in the brain that contain cerebrospinal fluid. So we have three main ventricles we're talking about today, and then we have one that connects two of the ventricles. So the first one I want to talk about is our lateral ventricle. So here we have a sagittal cut of the brain, which means we've cut it longitudinally down the longitudinal fissure, okay? So if we look in here, we have this space in here, and that entire thing will be our lateral ventricle. Above it, we have the corpus callosum. And so if you're ever looking for the lateral ventricle, we're going to find the corpus callosum first and go right inferior to that, okay? So our next ventricle is the third ventricle. I like to think of it, third ventricle surrounds the thalamus, so the two TH words go together. So this right here is our thalamus, and so our third ventricle is essentially a 3D space that surrounds the very surface of the thalamus. So we're going to have two thalami on either side of our our longitudinal fissure, and so the third ventricle will be between those two thalami. Now, we're going to have our fourth ventricle, which is down here. Our fourth ventricle will sit posterior to the pons and anterior to our cerebellum. So this right here, that space right there, will be our fourth ventricle. Connecting the third and the fourth ventricle, we have this guy right here, and that's called our cerebral aqueduct. So it's essentially just a little thin tube. Can we see that? A little thin tube that's going to connect our third ventricle to our fourth ventricle. Okay, so now if we move on to this brain here, this is going to be a coronal cut of the brain, so now we're cutting it from the side, okay? Here we have, again, our corpus callosum. So under our corpus callosum, we'll have these spaces right here, and these will be our lateral ventricles. Our lateral ventricles are separated by this right here, which is called our septum pellucidum. Also on this view, we can see the cerebral aqueduct. So if we go down here, we have a tiny little hole that my probe is sitting in, and that'll be our cerebral aqueduct. Okay, make sure to look for that in lab. Now, there's one more term that we find in the ventricles that I want to show you, and it'll be this in here. It's called our choroid plexus. Choroid plexus. So it looks like a grapevine. It's going to be a lot of little kind of globular things all connected together, and we can find it in any of the ventricles. This one happens to be in the lateral ventricle. Our choroid plexus is what's going to produce cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so now I just want to give you an overall picture of everything. This will be our diagram here, and this is what the ventricles look like. So we can see that they're all connected, okay? So it's a 3D structure. So instead of thinking of just individual spaces, think of how they're all connected together. So the lateral ventricle here, third ventricle surrounding our anothalamic adhesion, and we have our cerebral aqueduct, which goes down to our fourth ventricle right there.